everybody. Hi, I'm Darren Davidson. I'm the CSU Horticulture Extension agent in Boulder County, part of the team putting on this webinar today. And I am very happy to introduce John Murgel. He is the horticulture agent and for a little bit longer interim county director in Douglas County. Before joining Extension, he has had some very interesting jobs. I don't know about all of them, but he worked at Denver Botanic Gardens and he worked at the Denver Zoo, which I think must have been a very interesting place to work as a horticulturist. And he has a little tidbit that he wanted to share with you, and that is that he hates fixing irrigation. And so since this is a talk about water-wise gardens and how to be water thrifty with your gardens, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to have to mess with irrigation. So John, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. I hope that my share screen is working correctly now. I do that wrong every single time.
It looks great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So thanks for joining me today while I talk about dry gardening, complete xeriscapes. So why on earth would you want to grow an extremely dry garden? And I think there are a lot of reasons. And I'll start with aesthetic interest. Maybe you just like the way it looks. They can be very nice, right? So believe it or not, this garden here, for example, is completely unwatered, no supplemental water whatsoever. It's just whatever falls out of the sky. And every picture that I'm going to show you today, unless specifically noted, so there are some in the examples, but every picture I will show you today is either of an unwatered garden or of a plant growing in an unwatered garden. So just know that I'm not cheating and saying you should grow unwatered gardens and then showing you things that I pamper and water. You might have ecological concern as a reason that you want to grow a dry garden. You know, water is a precious resource. You want to make sure that you are being sustainable. You might want to reduce your water bills. Tired of seeing water run down the drain on the side of the street. So I paid for that water. And there it goes. There goes my money. Or like me, you may just be real tired of fixing irrigation. You might be thinking, but without water, my garden will it's going to shrivel up. It's going to look terrible. And just like all of these places, which are in fact, every one of these is a watered garden. So I show you this to try to draw the distinction between good gardens and bad gardens and watered and unwatered gardens. And those don't always line up. In fact, they're not necessarily related at all. And so just because you're watering a garden doesn't mean that it's going to be beautiful, as these pictures pretty clearly show, especially like when you can see the irrigation hanging out of the ground like you can in a couple of these places. It's just like, yikes. The water is clearly not doing all that much in terms of aesthetics for these places. And in some cases, I think if they just took the water out, the plants might actually do better. So let's talk about how are we going to do an unwatered landscape? How are we going to find the plants? How are we going to execute those? So here's an unwatered landscape. This is not have an irrigation system. They're not watering it at all, but this is in Pennsylvania. So of course it's unwatered there. It rains all the time in Pennsylvania. They've got this beautiful rich soil, right? Look, it's cloudy even on that day. Just perfect. The light's right. They've got all kinds of water. So say, all right, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to be planting these plants here and not watering them because it's just not Pennsylvania. Now here is an unwatered garden I can get behind, or an unwatered landscape I can get behind. But darn it, this one's in Arizona. So you might be thinking, well, I can't use these plants because they're going to melt when it comes to wintertime in Colorado. These aren't frost tolerant plants. So what am I supposed to do here? You know, I can't do unwatered garden in Pennsylvania because I don't get enough rain. I can't do unwatered garden in Arizona because these plants aren't hardy enough. But I'm here to tell you today that you can have an unwatered landscape along the Front Range, and it can look just as beautiful, just as inspiring as any of those other places by using plants that are adapted to here. So here is an unwatered landscape along the Front Range. That's close to as green as Pennsylvania was, I think. Here's an unwatered landscape in Fruita. where they get even less water than we do along the Front Range. In the Front Range, we get like 15 inches of precipitation a year. Fruita, they're lucky if they hit 10 inches a year. And there it is, an unwatered landscape looking just as green as those lawns across the street, with the benefit of flowers. So what's the secret to this? Putting the right plant in the right place, of course. And so here is landscape in Southeast Colorado. See this beautiful vista, and we could just transfer this right to our yard, right? Well, maybe not. You know, we don't have that much space unless you're a very special property owner and you've got thousands and thousands of acres. Your garden can't accommodate this. And if you said, I'm just going to try to recapitulate this landscape in my yard, you'd probably end up with something less than inspiring, because you'd just have something perhaps from the foreground there, which is dirt and a couple of scraggly grasses. But you could do something like this, which came from that same landscape. And this is, a minimalist approach. It's like a natural character pine that's growing there in Southeast Colorado. Pea gravel mulch, got a nice boulder, and then you have this little pinyon pine happily growing there by itself, again, without any supplemental water. No one's watering this. So you could lift this right out of this landscape, and put that in your yard, in your courtyard. If you have a condo, you put that, it's small, it would fit anywhere. So even though you don't have vast acreage, you can still find an unwatered landscape aesthetic that will work for you. So let's get into how are we going to choose these plants? How am I going to know what the right plant for the right place is? And to do that, we're going to need to understand how plants cope with drought and the different types of drought they're really going to be facing in a garden setting. So how do plants cope with drought? I will go from right to left. The first one is they just avoid it. And a lot of plants do drought avoidance. So bulbs are famous for this. They come up in the spring when growing is good. Temperatures are not so hot. There's plenty of water from melting snow. They get their life cycle out of the way, and then they disappear. Summer annuals, summer dormant annuals, I should say, would do the same thing. These are plants that you would find in places like Southern Arizona, for example, or like the Mediterranean, where you have a wet season or a couple of wet seasons, and then a season where you get no precipitation for months at a time. One of the common strategies a plant will use there is to just disappear for the dry part, hide out underground. Moving one step to the left would be leaf modifications. The two most common leaf modifications you'll find in drought-tolerant plants are fuzz and reduced leaf size. And sometimes those things can go together. So here you see we've got a thyme with very tiny leaves. They're actually kind of fuzzy too. And then we have a Salvia argentea silver sage, and you can see how fuzzy that thing is. And that fuzz really can help to, number one, screen the plant from UV radiation, but also makes a little microclimate right at that leaf surface to help minimize evaporation, and slow the transpiration process when the stomates are open on that leaf. One step to the left, succulents is a great way for plants to cope with drought. When growing is good, you store up a ton of water in your tissue, you get big and fat, and then that is often going to require you to defend yourself. And so there you can see one of the ways that plants cope with drought is they actually, many of them have adaptations designed to keep you away from them and their precious water. So the agave's got some spikes. You can see here, this acacia tree, not hardy here, but this acacia tree has some wicked thorns surrounding those leaves that say, yeah, that's my water in there. Nice try, but stay back. And so you'll see plants and you'll be choosing plants that have all of these characteristics for your garden. And that's where it may be, you can decide if you've got a dog, for example, that maybe agaves aren't for you, because you don't want an animal or yourself accidentally blundering into something that's defending itself. We could stick to the fuzzy things that are a little nicer. And then lastly, the last adaptation I want to talk about are plant roots, because those are going to be some of the most important things, and you're going to be garden prepping with roots in mind. So plants have roots, obviously, for the most part, except for a few air plants. And they are roots. I want to talk about two facets of root growth. There are fixed characteristics of roots, and that's pre-programmed by genetics, right? That's, oh, this plant grows a taproot. This has long fibrous roots that tend to stretch out along the surface, for example. Those would both be examples of genetically pre-programmed root morphologies. But roots are also very plastic. They change how they're growing in order to take advantage of the resources. And the resources that allow them to grow, it's not nutrients that's in your soil, it's air and water. And so in your garden, compaction is going to be your worst enemy. You need to make sure that the soil that your plants are going to be growing in has air and water so that the roots can grow there. If your soil is compacted 3 inches down, roots are only going to be in the top 3 inches of soil. And that's going to really severely limit the drought tolerance of a lot of your plants, especially if their drought tolerance is based on growing extremely deep roots down to the water table. If their drought tolerance is based on having ephemeral roots, like a lot of cacti, you might not have a problem. But again, for a lot of drought tolerant shrubs or perennials or grasses that want roots that go way down into the ground, if you have compacted soil, you're going to want to do something to mitigate that to have your best success. All right, what kind of drought are these plants going to be facing that they're using those adaptations to cope with? So the first one is just the drought that's imposed by our ecoregion. And that's going to be different depending on where you are in the state. So here you can see the EPA's map of ecoregions in the United States. Denver's in the High Plains. Grand Junction, on the other hand, is in the Great Basin. And so the types of drought and the seasonality of precipitation, the amount of precipitation, just based on where you are geographically, is the first and largest kind of drought, the most obvious kind of drought that your plants are going to have to face. And when you're choosing plants, unless it's a well-known garden plant, you might need to look for what ecoregion the plant is native to. Or you might even look for that with well-known garden plants to say, if this is from an ecoregion that's similar to mine, and that similarity, I mean, based on its precipitation patterns, then there's a good chance that that plant is going to be able to handle our area or your area without needing a lot of supplemental watering. Second to just ecoregion is going to be microclimates. And so that's where you might have, as in this case, a plant that's growing right next to a wall facing south. It's going to be a lot hotter and a lot drier, also warmer though. So you might be able to get away with plants that normally wouldn't make it through our winters. But that's a pretty intense place to be growing. For example, especially in an unwatered situation around here, it's hot and it's dry, right? Conversely, you might be on the north side of the house where it's cool and shady. You might have soil-related drought. We talked about that a bit with compaction, but here, for example, is some artemisia that's growing, and it's in a raised bed over some asphalt, and that raised bed is, I don't know, maybe 10 inches deep before it hits asphalt. So here, those roots are going to be considerably more limited in their ability to get water. Shade and tree roots are another type of drought that garden plants are going to be facing, particularly if you're converting an existing landscape into a xeriscape. Those trees are good at getting water. And so it's going to be a lot more droughty beneath trees and near trees than it would be if no tree existed. And then finally, wind, of course, just ripping water out of things, drying it out, and salt. And where are we getting salt? Primarily, around here at least, it's from sidewalk salt, a road de-icer that's splashing up into our gardens. So salt creates essentially like a chemical drought almost, because the more salt is in soil, the harder it is for the plant to draw the water up into itself from that soil. And so with all of those things in mind, I think it's important to note, which is why this is alone on a slide, that traditional gardening principles are of little use if you're planting an unwatered xeriscape. So if you're going to go and say, I'm going to plant this xeriscape plant or this unwatered garden, in the same way that I would grow cabbages, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Let's go into some general principles of how these gardens grow and some maintenance considerations. So first, let's talk about soil. The soil is the foundation of any garden. As I mentioned before, compaction is the enemy. Most of these plants for Colorado are going to be appreciating a stony, coarse soil with low organic matter. We love to say in Colorado, I have terrible soil. The soil is bad. And if you're planting an unwatered garden, oftentimes that soil is actually exactly what you want. It's good Those plants are going to be able to grow and thrive in them, that especially if you got a lot of clay, and can hold on to the natural water that falls. And then drainage from plant crowns is the other key. Many of these plants, especially again, if they're from high plains somewhere, or if they're from the Mediterranean, are used to growing in rocky soil where water quickly goes away from the crown and their roots go way down. And that's where they want it to be moist. They don't want water held up around their crowns. And so that's why using an inorganic mulch like gravel that helps water drain away quickly, or even using slight berms to help water drain away from the crowns where the above ground portion of the plant meets the roots, will help prevent plants that are adapted to extremely dry places, or at least seasonally extremely dry places, not rot when it's wet. Mediterranean plants in particular can take it very hot and dry, but they can't take it hot and wet. And so if you water those plants in a summer in Denver or in Grand Junction or in Pueblo, you're going to disintegrate them. Next up, let's talk about the size of plants and the type of plants that you're going to use in these gardens when you're transplanting. In general, smaller plants make the best transplants. These are hardened if you grow them indoors. You can grow them outdoors in a seed tray. If you find them at a garden center, make sure that they've been hardened or harden them yourself before you put them into the landscape. Large, tender greenhouse grown plants usually are going to suffer because they've lived their whole life on a cruise ship, living the good life. And then suddenly you're going to put them into a situation that is pretty unpleasant compared to that cruise ship. So even if that's a plant that should be adapted for those conditions, it's not acclimated to those conditions. And the larger it gets without acclimating, the harder it is for it to reacclimate and then establish. So start small and start tough. When you're planting these plants, it's important to try to rinse as much of that potting mix off as you can, so that you've got root contact with the native soil as quickly as possible, because that's going to help, again, that peat moss based potting mix that you often will see in plants that you purchase dries out really quickly. And if the roots haven't reached into the native soil and it's a windy day, that's just going to be dry, maybe in less than a day, and your plant will be cooked. So consider washing your roots of that potting mix before you plant these. This picture's here just to demonstrate the success that you can have with smaller plants. So this is a demonstration garden in Sedalia, and all the plants that you can see in that picture were planted the same year. That photo was taken in July. It was in late April that those plants were planted as seedlings that had barely 2 seed leaves. And you can see that many of them are flowering. So just because you start small doesn't mean they're going to stay small even in the same year. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but usually your first year might not be super inspiring. So here's a garden, and you can see on the left, that front part of the xeriscape is a couple years old. The right-hand side of the xeriscape was planted that spring. That is hardly inspiring. This is when neighbors are walking by going, "What are you doing?" This is when you're questioning if you've made the right choices, saying, "My word, it looks terrible. Look, I had that lawn, now I have gravel." But here's that same garden from a different angle 10 months later. So this is the following May. And you can see all of that space that had previously been essentially gravel moonscape is now looking pretty darn full. Some of the plants are still small. They're going to take longer to establish. But many of these plants started from seedlings again, grew incredibly quickly, and are already putting on quite a floral display. And you can see in this case, it was inspirational enough that more of the turf grass is gone. So you can see here's another uninspiring small plant land off to the right, because the big plants are right in front. So when are you going to be out there planting those seedlings? Take advantage of your early spring moisture. Garden early. As soon as you see perennials growing up or seeds sprouting in the garden naturally, that's when you should be getting your plants in. That's when you should be transplanting your seedlings if you're growing them at home into the ground so that they can establish quickly. So in this case, for example, you can see my chapstick there for scale. We've got some tiny seedlings coming up in a gravel bed. That would be when you notice this happening, either out in nature if you're out on a walk, or if you see this in other places in your yard. Hey, I've got seedlings and sprouts. That's the time to get your seedlings and sprouts in place. Once you've got things planted, It's important to water them deeply and infrequently in order to inspire the most root growth down into the ground. So one of the ways you're going to facilitate that, and the best way, in my opinion, is to plant in a little depression. So here's a tiny plant, rinsed its roots off. As you can see, that's got excellent contact with the native soil. Don't have it in a plug of peat moss. And I've just built this little lip. And if you don't want your new garden to look like the surface of the moon with craters, you can just smear, pea gravel or mulch across the top there and sort of hide that dip and depression. You also don't need to make them that deep, as you can see, but it's important that it be wide. Why is this? Because I'm going to go out there for my first year when I've planted these things and supplementally water to establish. So you're not going to be able to have a zero water garden until the end of your first year or year 2. And so when I'm watering my new transplant, I'm going to fill up that basin, and that is going to allow water to soak down into the entire area below the plant. Following that first year of establishment, might even be halfway through the summer or even just a month later, depending on what the weather conditions are like, what type of plant you're using, you can be done with supplemental watering and let this thing grow, because its roots are going to be, again, proliferating as that moisture descends from the surface. Those roots are going to be proliferating down along with the moisture to continue that water source through the dry parts of the year. A drip system, on the other hand, if you're going to use that, which is fine, if you're planning not to water it, I don't know why you'd go through the effort of installing a drip system. But again, remember, I hate fixing irrigation. So if irrigation is more your thing, yeah, put some drippers on things if you want to, but you're going to need to run your drippers differently than you might expect. So remember that drip irrigation in principle is designed to provide exactly the same amount of water that the plant is going to transpire during that day. So it's a net zero, like perfectly balanced. I'm going to drip half a gallon of water and you're going to transpire half a gallon of water. If you're going to use drip to establish a no water garden, you have to run those drippers for a long, long time, because the dripper needs to soak the area that you have soaked by filling up your basin, for example. So if you just soak this little area here next to the plant roots, where are your roots going to proliferate? Just right there. They aren't going to grow down. They're not ever going to make it deep into the soil, where for this plant, for example, they need to be to impart that highest level of drought tolerance. So make sure you're soaking the soil deep and infrequent. That means for your drippers, you might be, oh, I run it 15 minutes 3 times a week. It's not what you want to do for this. You want to run it for hours, maybe once every 2 weeks, so that, again, you soak that soil all the way down so that your roots can follow that moisture and get established quickly. Another important part of making sure that water stays in the soil instead of evaporating is mulch. And I think oftentimes we think, yeah, shredded bark, shredded wood, mulch, yes, excellent. And then inorganic mulch, like pea gravel. So here, I'm showing you an example of where pea gravel mulch and wood mulch are used the same. This is not a great idea, because again, remember that these drought-tolerant plants, so here zoomed in on the right, you've got Marubium rotundifolium, a silver heels horehound, and it hates having water around its crown. So you can see, to add insult to injury, they put a dripper right there on it to make sure that its crown stays nice and wet. And then all of that wood mulch can hold that moisture against the plant's crown. And you can see how happy that plant is about that. If they had just used that rock mulch, that pea gravel, all the way through, that would be much better for that plant. So this is suddenly becoming very popular to have rock mulch, except for right around the plants to have wood mulch. Don't do this. It's a terrible idea. Just use pea gravel mulch and save yourself time. I think it's prettier that way, and your plants will be happier. So you'll say, but John, what do you have against wood mulch? And ultimately, I have nothing against wood mulch. I use wood mulch. Wood mulch is wonderful. Research has clearly shown that it's beneficial. In an unwatered garden, though, it can be a bit risky for really 2 reasons. And those reasons are linked. So pea gravel mulch will transfer heat. Any inorganic mulch will transfer heat from itself to the underlying soil pretty readily. That's why, for example, in Phoenix, They don't like all that rock mulch because it transfers the heat to the soil, and then that heat can re-radiate out into the city at night and keep temperatures really high. We don't necessarily have that problem in Denver, but it's a concern, right? That, oh, okay, I'm transferring the heat to the soil and then it's going to re-radiate at night. Wood mulch and organic mulches aren't very good at transferring heat to the soil. That's why they will buffer soil temperatures, for example, at this time of year. They'll keep your soil more stably cool if you've got them mulched than if you had rock mulch over it. But in the summer, because that wood mulch can't very well transfer heat to the surrounding soil, it gets really hot. And in fact, wood mulch, the surface of wood mulch, can get even hotter than the surface of rock mulch in the summer, which seems counterintuitive until you walked on wood mulch in bare feet in the summer. They've clocked wood mulch at north of 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun in the summertime. Now, if you're a plant leaf and you touch that, it's not going to be fun for you. The other thing that can happen is that at those temperatures, the wood can pyrolyze, and that then, which is a heat-driven breakdown, and then it is colonized by fungi. So you can see here in the picture on the right, all of that fungal mycelium in this wood mulch that was in an unwatered, hot garden. Once the fungus is there, it glues everything together, and you're kind of making nature-made particle board. So you can see here on the left, you can just pick up big sheets of mulch that are stuck together with this fungus. And that's a bad thing in your unwatered garden, because your unwatered garden is going to be relying on things like summer rain showers. And if we get a quick 10-minute downpour, like we often do, at least along eastern Colorado in thunderstorm season, that water is not getting through that mulch. It's running right off of your particle board, out into the gutter, down the street, and not infiltrating the soil. On the contrary to that, inorganic mulch like pea gravel, as long as the particle size is small enough, will be an excellent weed suppression and will also help water infiltrate in the soils. The CSU study done in the late 60s actually demonstrated that pea gravel mulch or inorganic mulch with particle size less than ½ inch improves and increases the amount of water that will infiltrate the soil, particularly in quick irrigation events like giant thunderstorms. So instead of having all the water run off your ground, that pea gravel will let the water percolate better into the soil and get down there and help your plants. For weed suppression, if you're using wood chip mulch or pea gravel mulch, it needs to be 3 to 4 inches deep for weed suppression. For wood chip mulch in particular, people often don't put it down deep enough, and so it's just kind of there and not doing anything except for getting super hot. If you want it to suppress weeds, again, it's got to be 3 to 4 inches deep. If it's in the shade, then you're golden. It's not going to pyrolyze, and it's still a great mulch to use there. In the sun, pea gravel is probably a better option for an unwatered garden. Again, it needs to be 3 to 4 inches deep for effective weed suppression, and the particle size needs to be ½ inch or less. You get particle size bigger than that, like river rock or cobble, it's not effective as a weed suppressing mulch any longer. And in fact, doesn't even work that well to hold moisture in, because the spaces between the rocks are large enough that you can get eddies of wind swirling around in there, is one of the hypotheses that still allows evaporation to take the moisture right out of your soil. So 3 to 4 inches of pea gravel, I think, is the way to go. But if you really like wood chips, go for it. Just take real caution if it's going to be in the sun. So here's a recipe for disaster. Here's a 1 gallon succulents tender plant. This is Eriogonum aureum, which is a plant. So like plants, very drought tolerant. It's native across much of Colorado. You can find it growing in fields, certainly here in Douglas County, all over the place. Doesn't need any water. This one needs supplemental water to be happy though, because it was grown in a greenhouse, looks great. It's in this big fluffy potting mix. It's planted quite high, right? You can see it's at least 1 inch above grade. It's not in a depression at all. The potting medium is intact. And then it was mulched sort of with wood mulch. Again, that mulch is not deep enough. And it's also out in the sun. So this plant is dead now, very sad to report. And that's exactly what I would expect to happen to this plant. And so don't do what you see in this picture if you want to succeed. So now I'm going to talk about a couple other considerations. First one, so what about mature trees or established trees that I've planted in my landscape? And you do need to consider those if you're going from a watered landscape to an unwatered landscape, because those trees are acclimated to having supplemental water. So here, for example, this is a demonstration garden again in Sedalia, the other side of the building. This has been a watered garden for a number of years. You can see the irrigation head sticking up there in the front. It's being converted to an unwatered xeriscape. So in this picture, the Colorado Master Gardener volunteers are busily putting in pea gravel mulch. But I see some pine trees back there, and normally they'd be drought tolerant. We've got a ponderosa pine, we've got a pinyon pine, we've got some lilacs, which are also very drought tolerant, but they've been getting water, which means that their roots are in places that they wouldn't be necessarily if they hadn't been getting water. We've got them maybe closer to the surface, not as many going down deeply. And so during the first few years of this conversion, you're going to be wanting to carefully observe the condition of your trees and shrubs if they were established before you started this no water garden, to make sure that you don't kill them. It's epidemic right now, especially on the western slope. I hear from Susan over there that they're killing trees right and left because people take out their lawn and then don't water the tree for a while and the trees die. So you definitely want to keep an eye on your tree. You might need to supplementally water your tree. Depending on what kind of tree it is, it might be for the tree's life. If it's a drought tolerant tree, normally it might just be for a few, like 2 or 3 years, maybe, depending on your tree, before you can totally wean it off of supplemental irrigation. What about weeds? Here's an unwatered landscape close to my office, and it is lots of weeds. So weeds will happily grow in unwatered situations. How are you going to prevent them? Mulch is really the way to go. It's going to depend a bit if you've got perennial or annual weeds. If you have perennial weeds in the site before you put in your unwatered garden, it's really important that you manage those first before you try to do one of these conversions or establish your unwatered garden. Annual weeds, the mulch will take care of them. And then also remember that the ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure. So again, if you know you've got a weed issue, solve the weed issue before you plant your garden, because it's a lot easier to get rid of undesirable plants by whatever method you want, whether chemical or non-chemical, if you don't have desirable plants mixed in. One thing I will caution you against, though, is weed fabric. So people love weed fabric. It seems like a wonderful idea. And in fact, weed fabric does make a wonderful mulch if used alone, which no one ever does because it's kind of ugly if you use it alone. So you use it maybe in an agricultural setting, just across the surface of your crops. But as soon as you put something else on top of it, like wood chip mulch or gravel mulch or rocks, you're getting sort of the worst of both worlds, where you no longer have air and gas exchange through that weed fabric. Debris gathers on top of it, so weeds can still grow in it. And you perch the water on top of that weed fabric so that it can't actually infiltrate into the soil very well. So please stop with the weed fabric. This doesn't matter if you are in an unwatered or a watered situation. You've got 3 to 4 inches of mulch. You don't need weed fabric under it. And you will make, if you still insist to use weed fabric, the worst lasagna you have ever smelled. And so this you can see is some weed fabric, and what you see to the left of it is 2 layers of garden soil, I guess, that the water never drained from because it just perched on top of that weed fabric. Don't do this. It's a terrible idea. All right, what about fire? That's on everybody's mind right now. Should be all the time, especially if you live in a wild place interface. And if I'm going to have an unwatered garden, won't it be dry? Won't it be a fire hazard? And the answer is maybe, if you don't maintain it correctly. And that could go for any garden, because even a garden with water, if there's a firestorm approaching, is going to burn. So some general principles to bear in mind. You can see here the unwatered garden to the left, the lawn to the right. They're both pretty green. Inorganic mulch does not burn, so I would recommend, again, pea gravel over wood chips if you're concerned about fire. And then make sure that you don't have a buildup of dead debris. You don't want to have lots of standing dead biomass. This might mean that you're going to cut back in the fall instead of in the spring for your ornamental grasses or your other plants. And then plants like junipers that just gather detritus underneath them and are ready to burn at any moment would be plants that you might consider avoiding, simply because that dead biomass makes such a great place for fire to spread. But as long as your plants are green, and if you've got them planted appropriately and well established, those drought tolerant plants will be green, and don't let the dead material gather up around them. You can do just as well as your lawn in terms of trying to create a fire buffering zone in your garden. Speaking of cutting back, you're going to want to cut back, depending on your plants, usually once a year. This is to avoid, again, extra biomass, lots of soil building up that is going to create an unfavorable environment for some of those drought-tolerant plants. Depending on your garden style, if you just have a few drought-tolerant shrubs out, obviously you don't need to cut those back. It's just going to be a matter of cleaning up any dead leaves. If you have a garden like this one that's more full, then you could be out there with pruners, or you could take the quick way, which is to use a lawnmower. So as you can see here, I'm just going to run the lawnmower over it. It's springtime, help clean up some of those leaves. Now, a lawnmower is not going to work on everything, right? You don't want to mow over your false red yucca there, you see. But for a lot of these plants, the lawnmower works great. Put the bag on it, you're done. You got to sharpen the blade when you're done, but you should be sharpening your lawnmower blade anyway. All right. So that's general principles. Now let's talk about some design ideas. So this is the part where it's just like the eye candy show. This is my favorite part. So I'm going to show you some unwatered gardens locally, and then we'll talk about some plants that you can use. And this is almost a way to just prove that it's possible and to prove that it doesn't need to look dry. So here we go. So first, we've got the whole yard, right? This is a naturalistic style. You see again the pea gravel mulch. It's simple, it's peaceful, almost a Japanese garden style where you just have a few mounding plants, lots of space between them. You can pick out individuals. You don't have to do this naturalistically. This person could have chosen to use all those same plants and put a formal grass parterre across this with those 2-columnar junipers in a perfect row and had something very formal. So just because you're going with unwatered doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a naturalistic landscape. You could use these plants and these techniques with plants in any arrangement. It's just most people that are going unwatered seem to like the naturalistic look. That's a correlation. And so I don't have any pictures, of course, of anybody who's got a perfect hedge of unwatered gardens, but it's possible. There's no reason you have to go with the naturalistic landscape. Another great place to do this would be in what they call the hell strip, right? That space between the street and the sidewalk where nothing grows if you've got this sort of situation. So here's one, again, in Denver. I'm sure that the hell strips further up the street that you can see there are also unwatered, but which ones are nicer? I mean, I don't know. I'm partial to the one with flowers, but maybe you like things shorter and you just want the mown weeds. That's your business. This is close to a hell strip, and I call this the lawnmower's helper. Now, mind you, this garden is not itself watered, but look, it's right next to that really green lawn. So I'm sure some of these plants, if not all of them, are benefiting from the water that lawn is getting. You can see that this garden was actually installed, speaking of lawn mowing, to prevent the need to mow and trim around that split rail fence. And so you can, again, put this garden in any style to solve any problem that you normally would. Just say, oh, I'm going to use the plant palette and these techniques to make sure that it's an unwatered garden. And you could, of course, take the minimalist approach as well. So here's a residence on the western slope, and you can see it's got this Spiralcia, Cowboy's Delight, and then it's got buffalo grass and blue grama. And hey, it works great with that modern architecture. This really gets to a more Mediterranean look, in my opinion, because they're deliberately contrasting light and dark. So the darkness of the evergreen shrub, the darkness of the house with that light gold of the grass. And that's really borrowed from an artistic, well, I should say the artistic technique of chiaroscuro, which is like light and shadow that was popularized beginning in the Renaissance. Really comes from that Mediterranean landscape. The idea of this, you've got the dark green and then this golden color. And so you can go with that. It's, it's a classic look. It's not Pennsylvania, but it's still nice. And then of course you could do this in a mixture of things. So obviously these chrysanthemums are getting watered, but those containers are sitting in an area that is not watered at all. So this clearly was designed for a specific season. We're going to have red chrysanthemums, the red leaves, but then these agaves that are sort of pale greenish blue, they contrast great with that, and they're in this gravel bed that never gets watered. So if you want to save water, but you still want to have a floral display, you can consider doing something like this, where your containers, you can splurge in water, and then the landscape surrounding them is unwatered. And then lastly, I will encourage you to continue your timing. So if you or your client are going to be using the garden in the evening, consider what the light's going to look like in the evening as opposed to in the morning. Consider if the plants are going to be fragrant. So many of those same design principles that you would use in any garden situation are certainly going to apply in the case of an unwatered garden. So here again, it's completely unwatered garden. You might recognize it. It's the one that I showed you the uninspiring year one photo of. Here it is in the late afternoon, perfect for sitting on the front porch when that light is just perfect. All right, so now I want to go through my favorite part, which is the plant slideshow. So the number of plants that you could choose for an unwatered garden in Colorado is countless. Again, you're going to be picking plants that are from either native to here, which is awesome because you know they're adapted to our climate, or that are native to climates that are similar to ours. So those are going to be places like the Mediterranean, as long as they're cold hardy enough, places like Central Asia, certain parts of South Africa, any region with steppe or Mediterranean climate are going to be very, very productive for plants to use. I am going to show you plants through the season because one of the concerns with a zero water garden is, well, gosh, like it might look great in the spring, but then what? So we're going to go through the seasons to show you that with some care of plant selection, you can actually have something that looks good for 4 seasons. This for you, I think the fun is in experimenting, but if you want help picking plants, I would encourage you to reach out to your local extension office, talk to your horticulture agent, because they will be able to find plants that work well in your county, in your situation, to have that displayed. So here we go. This is now, I should also point, most of these plants I'm going to be showing you are growing on the front range somewhere. So if you're over on the western slope, if you're down closer to Trinidad, some of these plants are not going to work for you. But again, I encourage you to reach out to your extension office to find out what some great options in your area would be. Spring. So bulbs love Colorado for the most part. They're again ephemeral, they're adapted to come up and use that spring moisture and then disappear. And a lot of bulbs that we consider normal garden plants, for example, these tulips on the right, that we think, oh, I have to plant them and water them, do just fine in a bone dry situation. They sit underground, they're completely dormant and come up year after year after year. And in fact, some of those fancier cultivars can even be a little bit tougher, in my opinion, when they're not watered and pampered. Irises, species irises that are bulb work great. So here are 2 Iris reticulata. That's one of the purple one. That's one of the earliest flowers that you can get in the spring. Here's a Juno iris, Iris bucharica. That's not quite a bulb. It's more of a small tuber. Again, super drought tolerant, shows up, looks great. It's cute. It's yellow, looks like baby corn, then disappears for you. The other one here is a Colorado native plant. This is a Rigeron compositus. It's got nice ferny leaves. It's got these white flowers that explode and flower for almost a month. And then when it gets really dry, it might even disappear on you, but otherwise those ferny leaves will stick around. And some more bulbs. Mascari that you might think of again normally as something that needs lots of water or needs to be a standard garden perennial conditions, can take it completely bone dry, as can most narcissus. So here again, some dwarf narcissus. They don't need water. They can tolerate a lot of water. They don't need it. Crocus, the same idea, adapted to dry situations, could come up, show, early spring, and then they're gone for you. So once your bulbs are done, what are we going to do? We're going to get to late spring and early summer. And this really, for an unwatered garden in most situations, is the bonanza time. This is when people are going to become faint with the number of flowers in your yard or garden if you play your cards right. So again, I'm just going to show a few plants, but this is by far when you will have the biggest variety and the biggest palette to choose from of things that are going to flower. Some are unusual and some are everyday plants that you can buy at big box stores for that matter. So I'll start with a cactus and 2 cranberries. You'll notice that a lot of my pictures don't have cactus. I'm deliberately shying away from cactus. Cactus is an obvious xeristate plant. I personally hate gardening around cactus because I don't like stickers. But the one cactus that I will make an exception for is a kind of Cereus triglocytiotis, or the claret cup cactus pictured here in flower. That is the Colorado state cactus, and it does not have spines that come with you. So that's just got spines that if you touch it will poke you, but it's not the thing that's going to fill your fingers with things you find for weeks. So that's my preference. I will make an allowance for the Colorado state cactus. No other cacti are allowed near me. If you like cacti, knock yourself out. You plant your whole yard with cacti. That's your business. Two much nicer plants, in my opinion, are cranberry. Colt's foot, this big one in the middle, cranberry cordifolia. You'll see some shots of its foliage later. This is its like frozen exploded firework of white flowers that can be 6 feet tall. So pretty dramatic. And then Cranberry maritima, which is a plant select plant. It's called sea kale. Again, this explosion of white flowers, and then some really durable turquoise foliage that goes through the year as well. So these would be all excellent, all grow fine without a drop of supplemental water. Spring is also Penstemon season for the most part. So here are just a few with some pollinators for free. Penstemon palmeri is native. It's evening fragrant. So if your garden is one that you use in the evening, I would recommend Penstemon palmeri because you'll get that fragrance. Penstemon strictus or Rocky Mountain penstemon. It's another great option. And then, of course, here are 3 non-natives, or the enothera is close but not quite, that could go just fine with those native plants. So Aromaris foxtail lilies are really popular and dramatic, planted as a bulb. Salvias, there are both natives and non-natives. This particular one is a non-native, but many salvias, not all of them, but many of them are excellent drought-tolerant perennials. One of the ones that I first got started with was actually Salvia officinalis, or culinary salvia, culinary sage, that I bought on clearance at the grocery store because fresh herb season in the spring was over. So it's like, oh, $2 each, sure. And then you could build a formal hedge with those, for example, inexpensively, and they're very drought tolerant. And then, of course, Enothera speciosa. And if you've gardened with this one before, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, that thing's a thug, it grows everywhere, and then it gets powdery mildew. And those things are true, but if you never water it, you'd be surprised how well behaved Enothera speciosa can be. Also in the spring, again, just showing you some of the spectrum of plants that you can grow. Thymus nicephii, but many of the thymes are really drought tolerant. That's there on the left with the purple flowers, intertwined with a sedum, Sedum anacampseros, which once I heard described as adding new dimensions to cuteness. And it is very cute. And that's one where it's just foliage. So you're not growing that for its flowers necessarily. So you can get 4 seasons of interest out of that evergreen sedum. Here's Anacyclus depressus there in the middle. That's Mount Atlas daisy, makes a great pathway plant, opens its flowers wide in the sun, and when it gets cloudy, it closes them up, and you can see those beautiful pink reverses of the petals. And then, of course, my favorite native, Linum lewisii, or blue flax. You just can't get better than that sapphire blue color. And if you really wanted to, you could plant that with California poppies and have a Go Broncos garden. So football fans in your life, recommended stylistic choice. More for early spring and early summer. Again, the palette is humongous. We've got Baptisia australis back here in the left. That's almost native to Colorado, gets into Western Kansas, doesn't quite make it into Colorado. Super drought tolerant, in it for the long haul, and eventually can be quite a large statement perennial. The other purple back here, there's some Penstemon strictus way in the back, but this purple, Salvia moorcroftiana, that's a hybrid. That's a plant select sage. I call it Shangri-La sage because it's so lovely, and it is quite lovely. And I found that in my yard, it is among the very most popular plants with bumblebees, along with Echium russicum or red feathers. It's another plant select plant. And then, of course, here's an allium. I'm not sure which one it is. It's kind of a goofy white one, in my opinion, but it's a bulb, so I would expect it to perform well. And again, so you might be thinking, like, who's ever even heard of these plants? And some of them are harder to find than others, but they're getting more popular, especially at garden centers. But you can do this with perennials that you see every single day. For example, lower left, oriental poppies, Papaver orientale. Here's Dianthus fire witch, Maynite salvias, Centranthus or Jupiter's beard. These things are all perfectly capable of growing here with 0 supplemental water. And in fact, in all of these photographs, these are plants growing in gardens that are never watered, other than what, again, falls from the sky. So these are all plants that are perfectly capable of growing without extra care. We just need to be brave enough to stop giving them extra care. All right, let's move on to midsummer and early fall. This is shrub season, in my opinion. So you've got here Chamaebateria millifolia. whose common name just escaped me. It's a plant select shrub, and you see bees love it. It's very fragrant. It's in the rose family. Fern bush is the common name because of these nice ferny leaves. So here's a picture of a garden in July 7th, so very early summer. Here's the geranium down at the bottom. Here's that Cranby cordifolia that you saw, that big explosion of white flowers earlier in the year is now just green sticks. You could cut that off if you wanted to. You could leave it for if you like that aesthetic interest. That light purpley pink is Salvia scleria. Again, another salvia. It's not native here, but it's beautiful. Long-lasting bracts that last longer than the individual flowers. So very long season of display. There's Achillea coronation gold, the yellow thing way in the back. And then after your oriental poppies are done flowering, you could plant some opium poppies or some breadbugs poppies. These are not going to be things you're going to be harvesting for nefarious purposes, but just obviously for how beautiful they are. There are a number of cultivars. This is one that's a peony flowering double. But again, very happy to grow without water. When it gets dry in the summer, when they're totally done, they will turn brown. And so this is one that you want to probably cut back sooner than later to make sure that it doesn't just be a zombie in your autumn garden. Also in the summer is when a lot of plants from the southern United States will start flowering. So here, for example, is beargrass, but also yuccas will be flowering in June and early July. And then one of my favorites is berlandiro lorata, chocolate flower, right? So it smells like chocolate in the morning. It's wonderful. And it can flower pretty much all season long, which is a great, great attribute to have around here, in my opinion. This, depending on when you are, can also be somewhat rambunctious, but again, in a completely unwatered situation, is usually a bit better behaved than you would find in an open garden that you're watering. Again, for more, enothera macrocarpa. This is a campanula recurva growing with sedum angelina. Again, that sedum is flowering here, but also has ornamental foliage that is great all year long. And then our native prickly poppy. I was so impressed with this poppy in 2020, which was a really dry, hot summer. This thing was flowering all over the Front Range. It looked amazing, where few other plants even bothered to flower. This is one that was really, really in it, putting on a great display. I have never found this plant for sale as a plant, but seeds are readily available. So this would be one that you could plant directly in the garden or start your own plants. Here's one summer flowering Penstemon. Penstemon barbados is one of the latest summer flowering plants. And then Mirabilis multiflora, which is becoming more and more popular as a garden plant. That one is native in southern Colorado. If you're ever driving in the early summer between, say, Walsenburg and Gardner, this thing is all over the roadside, and it is amazing. You can grow vines, and these two are tropical looking and a bit surprising, in my opinion. The first on the left is the least surprising of the two, Linosaurus sempervarans, or honeysuckle vine. Number of cultivars, again, once they're established, really need no supplemental water whatsoever. The one that floored me, and that I think you would certainly want to have established first, is Passiflora cerulea. This should not be hardy here, but I have seen it in at least 3 places growing perfectly happy. And this is in a warm microclimate. So again, this is on the southern facing wall, getting 0 additional irrigation whatsoever. All 3 places are in Denver, 0 supplemental irrigation, and swallowing the structures that they're growing on. And so this is one where you can make a pretty tropical looking place with these passion flowers and not use a drop of water. So you don't need to have bananas, or you could just keep your bananas in your container and then have the passion flower as your accent. Here's that Salvia scleria. And again, back there at the back, a knockout rose that pre-existed this garden going completely water-free, still happily growing with 0 water. So roses, once they're established, you'd be surprised how tough they can be, at least some of them. All right, now everyone's sad spot, fall and winter. What's gonna happen? It's gonna be ugly? I mean, maybe. I like to think of it as threadbare charm. It's at least as nice as dormant turf or spaded up annual beds. But let's see, because I actually think there's some things here that are gonna be quite beautiful. So first, late summer, early fall, you've got Liatris Punctata here on the left. It's a native plant, can take it bone dry. I see it die in gardens when it gets watered. In the middle, I don't have a good photo of Aster oblongifolius. This is the best one I have with just 5 measly flowers, but you can see all the buds on it. This photo was taken last year in early October when it was just starting to flower. And then here on the right, Eriogonum effusum, that's another native buckwheat that just makes this little white puffball. And I'll give you, that's not for everybody, but aesthetically, I think it can be great. Also late fall, again, here's a North American native salvia, Salvia gregoide. This is a wild thing, that's a plant select. In the right microclimate, if you're in zone 5 or 6, it's going to do great. If you're in warmer climates, it's going to do great again, 0 supplemental water. Here's an annual, Helenium Dakota Gold, growing with 0 supplemental water. It will reseed itself a bit. And then a Senecio. And there are lots of, I mean, yellow asters, the number of these are, in the thousands. I draw your attention to this one particularly because the character of its yellow is much more lemon yellow than golden yellow. So in the fall, it always strikes me as unusual because it's a springtime yellow. And I probably seem completely nuts to you now, but trust me, it's different. Here we are in late October with that fern bush again, giant saccaton grass, and then Ericameria nasiosa. This is the baby kind, variety nasiosa, that even when it's done flowering, makes kind of an adorable poof. And then through the actual winter, you do have some options. So there's Yucca bakata here on the right, beautiful architectural statement. It's actually growing in front of a mountain mahogany, Cercocarpus ledifolius. And then Cyclamen heterofolium, which does great in dry shade. You can order it as a bulb. It will flower for you in late fall, but even through the winter, you can see these beautiful ornate leaves. So it's not going to be something that somebody driving by is going to slam on their brakes to look at your garden, but you can go out on that warm December day and admire these beautiful pink flowers and these leaves. That picture of leaves on the left was actually taken just a couple days before Christmas, a couple years ago. Here's my second Echinus cereus picture because they're beautiful in the winter too. Rosemary in the right spot here can grow well. Look for a cultivar called ARP, which is from ARP, Texas. It's the hardiest one available that I know of. And then here's an agave in the winter I like to think of this as a loving embrace and not a death match with that Delosperma that's intertwining it. And of course, who doesn't love agaves and yuccas in the snow? I mean, come on. All right, so at this point, I will, in the last couple minutes here, take a look at some questions. All right, Debbie asked what the large flowered plant is in the health strip slide. If they were white flowers, that was a datura or Jimson weed. And that is a native plant. So Marianne, now is a good time to plant. Yeah, it's coming right up on it in a lot of the state. Again, when you start to see seedlings and perennials starting to grow, that is a good time to be getting out there, getting that soil worked. Again, it's key that the plants be hardened. You don't want to go to the covered part of the nursery, the greenhouse, and pop those out. That won't end in success. But if you've got them grown or if they're hardened plants, I always like to ask the people at the garden center, and they always look annoyed, but they always do it for me anyway, because I'm going to spend money. Ask like, where are your hardened perennials? Where are you overwintering things? And then they will sell them to you, and they're hardened, and you can put them right in the ground. All right. Do you find that the Argemini transplants well? I've honestly never tried to transplant it. I've always direct sown it. As a rule of thumb for transplanting any of these things, since oftentimes they are deep rooted, again, the smaller the better. So if you're going to try to grow that in a plug tray or something and then transplant it, I would consider transplanting it even when you first see its first true leaves. Go for it. And Nat asks if ARP is edible. Yes, it is a variety of culinary rosemary. So it is just a cultivar, but it is rosemary that you could use. What are the grasses on the naturalist garden? Oh, that was Sporobolus heterolepsis or prairie drop seed. No, Sporobolus aeroides, A-I-R-O-I-D-E-S. So it is a saccaton grass. It's alkali saccaton is the common name, but Sporobolus aeroides was that very light, fluffy thing. Let's see, do these plants need to be watered for the first 1 to 2 years to get them established? So that's a great question, Ruth. And the answer for the most part is no. They need to be watered for the first, depending on how big they are and depending on your soil and how well you rinse off their planting medium. It could be anything from water it once and then walk away to water it for the first season. But none of these things should need water past the first growing season. The smaller the plant, the quicker they establish. But no, it's not a long period of establishment for many of them. Datura is amazing, but isn't it poisonous? Yes, it is. Many of the plants that you grow in your garden every day are poisonous. So make sure that you know not only just the famous ones, but all of them, because as I like to say, every plant on earth is trying to kill you. They just haven't all figured out how to do it yet. But yeah, Datura is definitely poisonous. Seeds under rocks will start well. So Carol, ask again if I don't answer this exact question. Seeds in a thin layer of pea gravel mulch, like if you only put down a ½ inch or an inch of pea gravel mulch, that can make a great germination bed because it holds that moisture there. Let's see. Any suggestions for 4 to 5 foot shrubs off the front porch on the north side? You know, for specific plant recommendations, I would say my email was at the beginning. It's on our website, and maybe someone would be kind enough to drop it in the chat. If you want to email me or contact your local extension office, who's going to know the local conditions better than I will, that's probably the better place for specific. If you've got a specific "what plant should I plant here" question, I'd say either email me, call my office, or contact your local extension office. Mary Jo, best way to get rid of sod. I will refer you to Tony Koski's webinar of 2 weeks ago, which is all about converting turf. And let's see. So in marine, to offer assistance for design or planting. So we don't extension provide design advice, but I can refer you to Plant Select and the Colorado Native Plant Society, both of whom have prefabricated printable free designs for gardens with plant recommendations on their websites.